By the late 1860s, British Columbia stood like a distant outpost at the edge of history, marooned between collapsing illusions of imperial permanence and the rising storm of continental realignment. The gold rush was gone, the debts remained, and the very purpose of the colony, created with such urgency in 1858 to keep the Americans at bay, was in question. By 1869, British Columbia was not deciding what it wanted to become, it was deciding whether it could survive at all. And in that desperation, the idea of joining Canada, a union of British North American colonies born in 1867, gained its foothold, not out of zealotry or sentiment, but out of necessity. Confederation in the East had begun in ambition, but was propelled by anxiety. The American Civil War had left no illusions. The British North American colonies, Canada East and West, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, were too scattered, too weak, and too exposed to endure alone. Unity was their best defense. At the Charlottetown and Quebec conferences of 1864, leaders like John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and Charles Tupper envisioned a new dominion, a federation that would unite oil colonies under a constitutional monarchy, bound by shared interest and mutual protection. By 1867, that dream became a law through the British North American Act, and the Dominion of Canada was born. But even before the act had been passed, the architects of Confederation had turned their gaze west. British Columbia and the vast Rupert's Land of the Hudson's Bay Company were essential pieces. A Canada that stopped at the Great Lakes was a curiosity. A Canada that reached the Pacific could be a nation. And in the minds of many in London, this was not a choice, but a geopolitical imperative. As historian W.L. Morton would later observe, the empire could not afford a collection of weak colonies in North America, each charting its own course, when the United States had already demonstrated what it could become. To the British, the answer was clear. The Colonial Office began to press for union, not with thunderous declarations, but with polite persistence. Governor Frederick Seymour, who governed British Columbia from 1864 until his death in 1869, was a capable man, but an imperial conservative. He did not support Confederation and resisted efforts to promote it, believing the colony could stand on its own. In his words, the idea of union with Canada was premature and unwise. Yet Seymour's tenure only underscored the problem. The colony was sinking into economic and political stagnation. After the Cariboo Gold Rush peaked in the early 1860s, the economy faltered. Revenue from mining and land sales plummeted. Public works projects, including the wildly ambitious Cariboo Wagon Road, had saddled the colony with a crippling debt of over $1.3 million, much of it borrowed at high interest rates from British bankers. With a population of just over 10,000, the cost per capita was ruinous. As historian Gene Barman notes, the colony had built itself for a future that never came. The gold had been a mirage, and now British Columbia was left with broken dreams, unpaid bills, and a dangerous reliance on trade with the United States. At the same time, political discontent was festering. British Columbia and the colony of Vancouver Island had been united in 1866, largely due to British pressure, but the marriage had been one of necessity, not love. Victoria became the capital, leaving residents of New Westminster bitter. The Legislative Council, nominally a representative body, was dominated by appointed rather than elected members, further inflaming cries for reform. There was no responsible government, no cabinet answerable to a majority in the House. The colony remained under the control of a governor who reported to London, and increasingly, the colonists saw that London no longer wished to listen. In this environment, a small but vocal group of Confederation advocates began to organize. Chief among them was Armand de Cosmos, a flamboyant, tireless, and sometimes erratic politician who founded the British colonist newspaper and used it as a pulpit for Canadian union. Born William Alexander Smith in Nova Scotia, he changed his name, Lover of the Universe, as a gesture to his romantic ideals of progress, science, and reform. But de Cosmo was more than an eccentric. He was a populist, a constitutional reformer, and an early prophet of the Canadian idea. In editorials and speeches, he attacked the colonial elite as a clique and argued that Confederation would bring responsible government, railway connection, and economic salvation. The sooner we cease being a burden to Britain and become a part of the great new Dominion, he wrote, the better for all. Another strong supporter was John Sebastian Helmeken, a former Hudson's Bay Company surgeon and legislator who had married into the powerful Douglas family. Helmeken was cautious by nature, loyal to British Columbia's autonomy, and deeply suspicious of Canadian intentions. But even he began to recognize that the colony's financial position was untenable. While he hesitated to endorse Confederation outright, he was instrumental in shaping the terms under which the Union might be acceptable, terms that included the assumption of the colony's debt, generous annual subsidies, and the construction of a transcontinental railway to connect British Columbia with the rest of Canada. Meanwhile, Israel Powell, a physician and political organizer in Victoria, emerged as another key voice. Powell founded the Confederation League in 1868 alongside de Cosmo and Robert Bevan. The League was formed specifically to campaign for union with Canada and lobbied hard to sway public opinion. Their arguments were plain and compelling. The colony was broke, trade with the U.S. was unreliable and increasingly costly due to tariffs, and Canada, flush with promise and protected by empire, offered political stability, financial relief, and a railway to the future. In the legislature, the issue came to a head in 1868 and 1869, when a series of debates and informal votes tested the colony's appetite for union. While no formal vote on Confederation passed in those years, the tide was turning. Petitions in favor of union began to circulate, especially in Victoria. A resolution in 1869 to open formal negotiations with Canada failed by only one vote, an indication that support was growing even among once skeptical members. But resistance remained. Some feared domination by central Canada. Others preferred annexation to the United States, pointing out that American railways were already inching toward the Pacific, and that trade with San Francisco was far more practical than with far-off Ottawa. A small but vocal independence faction believed British Columbia could chart its own course as a Pacific nation. Yet all these visions were undermined by the same reality: debt, distance, and drift. When Governor Seymour died suddenly in 1869, the British government seized the opportunity to advance Confederation more aggressively. His replacement, Anthony Musgrave, was a former governor of Newfoundland and a skilled administrator with clear instructions: bring British Columbia into Canada. Musgrave, though not a visionary, was a diplomat. He understood that the time for delay had passed. He began quiet conversations with Canadian officials, helped ease opposition in the legislature, and laid the groundwork for the final negotiations that would take place in 1870. By the end of 1869, British Columbia had not yet joined Confederation, but it was no longer an open question. It was a matter of how and when, not if. The choice had become clear. The colony could not remain alone. The empire no longer wished to pay its bills. The Americans eyed the coast hungrily, and the only realistic alternative, joining Canada, promised solvency, self-government, and a connection to a larger future. As it might have been put, history was no longer offering options. It was issuing ultimatums. And in the gathering dusk of empire, British Columbia began, cautiously and haltingly, to step toward the dawn of Confederation. Join us next time for part 11 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore Seward's visit in Alaska, encirclement.